Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. I want to welcome all of you to the second half of the NYU Reynolds Social Entrepreneurship in the 21st Century Speaker Series. My name is Gabriel Bradbar. I'm the Executive Director of the NYU Reynolds Program, and I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to introduce Europe Executive Director and Founder, Gerald Chertavian. For those of you who aren't that familiar yet with Europe, it's an extraordinary organization that connects young people, 18 to 24-year-olds, with the skills, the resources, and the opportunities that they need to realize professional careers and higher education. Now, this is the 7th year of this speaker series, and over that time we've had some extraordinary social entrepreneurs and change makers on the Reynolds stage, but I am genuinely hard-pressed to think of any other individual or any other organization that so clearly embodies some of the fundamental principles of social entrepreneurship, as well as the promise and the power that its new paradigms hold for realizing actual, real, sustained social change. So what are some of these principles that Year Up embodies? Well, one I think is transparency. I think another is how quickly and effectively they scaled up their organization. I think their embrace of cross-sector partnerships as a critical and necessary part of their mission is another. Their consistent execution, the principle-driven passion of their staff, their use of continual feedback loops to ensure constant quality improvement. These are all hallmarks of an incredibly well-designed and well-run social entrepreneurial organization. But the fundamental that they embody the most, and I think the thing that really defines them as an organization, is their focus on outcomes. Right? It's on outcomes that they demand to be judged, and it's on outcomes that they expect to get paid. Now, this stands really in stark contrast to the 47 other job readiness, federally funded job readiness programs that collectively got paid, and this is just an astounding number, $18 billion in 2009 alone, right? And mind you, that wasn't for actually placing people in careers as Year Up so effectively does, but rather their attempts to do so. The difference here, it's process versus outcomes, right? And that makes all the difference in the world if your goal is real, sustainable social change. As for the power of new paradigms, I think Gerald and Year Up have a beautiful and elegant and simple theory of change. I'm going to tell you what it is. You can help transform thousands of lives simply by doing a better job of meeting the hard-to-fill talent needs of America's best companies. And in this regard, I think Gerald really is in the talent pipeline business. He's an entrepreneur who recognized an extraordinarily and very valuable yet untapped resource. The drive, determination, promise, and intellect of 18 to 24-year-olds that happen to be from inner city, wrong side of the tracks USA. And he sells this desperately needed talent resource to companies like Wells Fargo, Bank of America, AT&T, Georgia Pacific, PayPal, and State Street, just to name a few. And that's really, I think, his pitch to these critically important corporate partners. Great talent that can be recruited and retained at an amazingly competitive cost. It's a value proposition that simply makes good business sense. Now, of course, we all know Gerald is more than just in the talent business. If he was, we would not have come here to learn from him today. I think Gerald is ultimately in the social and the economic justice business. What Year Up is providing is a chance for folks who are born and raised in the wrong part of town to leap over and ultimately close this massive opportunity divide that exists in this country. And in so doing, lives are changed, dormant talent is unleashed, and the economy is strengthened. At the end of the day, Year Up is all about, and I'm paraphrasing one of their alums here, ensuring that zip code does not determine destiny. And then he leverages that new reality to do nothing short of improving the economic and social conditions of his country. It's not too shabby. I can promise we're going to hear some really fascinating, insightful, and inspiring things today about Year Up and their amazing students. I encourage all of you to participate in the conversation that's going to follow Gerald's presentation. And I do want to add that I actually just finished his book, New York Times bestseller, A Year Up. It's an incredibly powerful story. It's an incredibly important work. I received no compensation for this endorsement, and you'll have the opportunity to buy signed copies outside after the event. So please join me in very warmly welcoming to the NYU Reynolds stage, Gerald Chertavian.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Thank you very much, Gabe, and congratulations to you on everything you have done here at Reynolds and pushing forward on something that I know you and I have both heard David Gergen talk about, is one of the next steps in the continuation of the civil rights movement, which is the social entrepreneurship movement. So I think the work you're doing and have been leading is incredibly important. We need it across this country, and I think holds one of the promises of how tomorrow we'll solve increasingly our social challenges. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. Good afternoon to you all. Good afternoon to you all. There you go. We're going to wake folks up. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here with you. Absolute pleasure. I flew in this morning from Boston, and the accent will give me away as I go forward, I'm sure. But flew in this morning from Boston and took the usual trip I take into Manhattan, which is down FDR South. The reason I do that is every time I come to New York, regardless of where I'm going, I try to get on the FDR South, is I get to go by one apartment that is very, very meaningful for me in the history of my life and really changed my life. And it was the apartment that this young boy grew up in. I'd appreciate no comments on, yes, my hair was a lot less gray when that photo was taken than it is today. And young David Heredia, who grew up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in 54 to 64 Rutgers Street, to the corner of Delancey and Rutgers Street, in what was then in 1987, when that photograph was taken, one of the most heavily photographed crime scenes in New York City. And if folks were here in New York during that time period, you knew what the crack AIDS epidemic was doing in our housing developments, in our inner cities, in New York City. And so little David grew up almost never getting to go outside, although he had a beautiful park right behind his house. But going out to that park would be considered ill-advised. What I learned as I spent every Saturday of my life for the next 3 years, and admission, I was not an investment banker. I wasn't smart enough. I was a commercial banker, so a slight difference on the title. I did work on Wall Street during that time, and every Saturday I spent in that housing development up in apartment 18G with David. He had 4 brothers, Willie, Julio, Carlos, and Edwin, all older, none of whom were able to get to college and navigate higher education. And after 3 years of Saturdays, what I saw was here were some of the smartest, most hungry, motivated, hardworking young men and women I'd ever met in my entire life. I'll never forget the day his brother Willie out-argued me so voraciously and convincingly that I could only think what our country would benefit if Willie was an attorney, arguing for something around civil and social justice. And so I saw we were wasting a huge amount of human capital in a country where we have no one to waste. It was at that point in the late 80s, having learned, for me, the most valuable lesson in my life, was that the waste of talent represented in what I was seeing did not have to be. We didn't have to accept this. It didn't have to be the way the world was going to be or the country was going to be. And so I ended up writing my essays at that point to get into graduate school at Harvard to somehow close that divide, which we call an opportunity divide. Here you go. How you doing? To close that opportunity divide represented by David and certainly his brothers and cousins and everyone who lived in that development. I was very fortunate to make that dream come true about 10 years later. So just to roll the story forward, I was in software for about 10 years. After I got out of grad school, was very lucky and fortunate to be in that industry at a time when even dummies like me could be successful in technology. In the 90s and the advent of the internet and the dot-com bubble. But when I sold my business in '99, it put me in a position to go back to the essays I'd wrote in '89 and basically say, now's the time to figure out how do you close this opportunity divide across the country, and imagine hundreds of thousands of young people like David who need that opportunity to realize their God-given potential. So, and I'll come back to why I think this is important. And as you think about contemplating starting social ventures and a career in this space, is what those formative experiences do to seal and cement your passion and your vision and your commitment to a cause. What I didn't realize at the time was David represented one of what is now 6.7 million, what are called by the government, we think the term is pejorative, disconnected young people between the ages of 16 and 24. It represents about 18% of all young people in America today who would be classed as disconnected. We tend to think of that as opportunity youth, not disconnected youth. And that means they're out of school, out of work, and don't have more than a high school degree. So that's getting close to 20% of all people in this country between those ages. Think about running a democracy, a civil society, when 1 out of 5 people are out of school, out of work, and don't have more than a high school degree, at a time when your economy is demanding post-secondary education and skills to prosper and earn a livable wage in a knowledge-based economy. So at the same time, there are young adults who are out of the mainstream. You have 3.4 million open job vacancies today in America. And in fact, every month since the recession started, there have been more than 3 million open job vacancies in America. And as McKinsey would tell us in their research, it's taking twice as long to fill those open job positions. There's a dichotomy here, right? How can you have so many folks available, so much talent available, and at the same time, companies are not able to find the skills they need to fuel their companies and drive forward? So we have this skills gap, a growing skills gap in the country, projected to get much worse before it gets better. We see it as an opportunity. We think about those opportunity youth, how we can connect supply and demand, and in so doing, help our country. Because we won't have a globally competitive country if we don't have a skilled workforce. And increasingly, we compete cross-border on talent, on knowledge. And that'll be the game, I think, going forward we compete on. So that was the broader problem we started to learn about that we're trying to solve. And hence led ultimately to our mission statement, is to close that opportunity divide for those young adults by providing them with the skills, the experience, and the support that they need to realize their God-given potential. And today that is both in higher education and careers. So we're going to do a real, I'm not sure of this group, but it'll probably work. Humor me for a sec. Raise your hand if you have a college degree. Okay. Keep it up if you got it between the ages of 18 and 22. Right. Just have a look around this room. Just look around. Someone just give me a guess about how many hands are up. What percentage would you guess? How much? 80, 90, about that? Now, if you ask those same 2 questions, you have a college degree and did you get it between the ages of 18 and 22? Ask those same 2 questions of any 100 adults across all of America, how many hands would be up? Just pick a random sample across America, 100 people, ask those 2 questions. 90% of our hands were up. What percent would be up across America? 30? 20? 8 hands would be up. Gasp from the audience. 8 hands would be up. And that's the truth today in America. The average age of a Bachelor of Arts is about 28. The average person in America who goes to college works 30 hours a week. Half of all the people who go to college work full-time. Higher education is changing in terms of consuming both credit-worthy and pay-worthy activities at the same time, and finding ways to combine those in ways you can get a degree and feed yourself and take care of yourself. So always in our mission statement, it's not just careers, it's not just higher education, it's a combined dual outcome for a young person realizing you need that further education and you need a way to support your belly, feed your belly while you're feeding your brain. It was that model we took with 22 students in 2001. This one-year program, as Gabe talked a little bit about, students come to us after high school or after they've gotten a GED for 6 months. Intensive training and development from some of my colleagues I see here in the audience. They're learning professional skills, what we call the ABCs, attitudinal, behavioral, and communication skills, consistent with a knowledge-based job. And then learning something marketable, technology, finance, somewhere we know there's demand in the marketplace. They're earning college credit while they're with us through our articulation, our dual enrollment agreements with colleges around the country. They're also earning a small stipend because they're coming to us 8:30 to 3:30 every day. So if you're not earning some stipend, you can't feed yourself. You can never invest in your own human capital. It's a very rigorous 6 months. And after that, they earn that 6 months. They earn an internship in one of about 250 companies across the country where they work for 6 months, showing what they can do. And I'm so proud to say NYU is one of our partners, and I want to thank them very much because the leadership here at NYU said, we see those young people, young David, as an asset and not a liability. Right? We see the potential resident in our young folks. And as I learned in David, the only things limiting David were the fact he had the wrong zip code, the wrong bank balance, his mom didn't speak English, he had a skin color that's still stereotyped in this country, and he had a wrong education system growing up. Any of those things related to his ability, his God-given ability? They're not. I go back to think about David. It struck me. I'll tell you the story. I went in to his school, PS 62, as his parent on Parents' Night because his mom didn't speak English. And I was so excited. I was 23 years old. I went in. I said, hey, I'm here as David's father. And they probably looked at me slightly. They said, I'm here as David's dad. How's my son? How's he doing in school, in your class? And the teacher looked at me, and he looked up. And he said, David, David, David. Which one is he? Now, if that doesn't define educational inequality in America, nothing does. Right? But that was David's reality. Right? So he didn't have that access and the opportunity. It always stuck with me what Parents' Night felt like and what that might have felt like for some parents whose teachers weren't able to get to know their student. Probably wanted to, but in the numbers of people in his class, it was pretty difficult. So this program of 6 months of training and development, 6 months of an internship, that completes 1 year. And now imagine a student who's got NYU in college credit on their resume versus high school and McDonald's. You literally leapfrog over poverty, and you will never again in your life compete for minimum wage jobs. Gone. You will never again compete for that job because you're in a different labor market with a different set of skills that you can bring to a set of employers who we know from that chart need those skills. We grew that program not because of anything we as staff could do potentially well. We grew the program because those young adults went to places like Google, Goldman Sachs, and the federal government, and they came back to us and said, those are wonderful young people, we want more. And those organizations contribute this year to us about $30 million in revenue to help fund the program. Because they are paying for talent, paying for a pipeline of talent that they need to grow their companies. And so it's really on the student success and the proof that they're assets. We've been able to grow this program from 22 students. We've served just shy of 8,000, expanded to 11 cities. The organization is about a $61 million organization overall, and about 300 staff in those 11 cities around the country. But it's all worked because those young people are assets, and given the appropriate access and opportunity, the next best person you could hire to help fuel your companies going forward. As Gabe said, we're hugely outcomes focused. In fact, I get pushed emails from our data system, which is incredibly well developed of a management information system. Every single night I'll get an email that says who got a job today across our network. In fact, I just looked at it on the plane down this morning. We had 25 folks get a job yesterday. Average wage was probably about $17, $18 an hour. And the companies was the list of who's who across America. Like, if that isn't social justice, nothing is. And I go back to think about social justice. What were the last things that Martin Luther King was talking about when he was on Washington in 1963 on August 28th, the million-person march on Washington? They were talking about jobs and freedom. Not just freedom, jobs and freedom. And so economic justice is deeply, deeply part of the movement for rights and civil rights in this country. And so every time I see those emails, I think that's we're one step closer to creating a country where everyone has the ability to get their own economic security. So yes, we track how many of our students are employed. We track how much they make. We assiduously work with our corporations to make sure they are happy with what they're getting. I'll show you a quick video of one of our students in just a sec. This was at the Clinton Global Initiative, and a young man who saw himself differently having gone through the program.
The promise of America is that each and every one of us has power to write our own story. This means that if we are given the right support from people in society, and that if we work hard, we can forge a path to a better life. This wasn't true for me growing up in Baltimore. I always had a passion for media and technology, and I knew I needed to go to college, but lacked the right resources and guidance to prepare for my future. Before enrolling in Europe, I had left college and was working at 2 restaurants without any career prospects. I knew I wasn't reaching my full potential, and I felt that my story was being written for me, that my zip code would become my destiny. I am now working full-time at Radio 1 as an IT network technician. My experience at Europe helped me write my own story. I'm a talented young man with a bright future. I'm an IT professional. I'm a valued team member. I'm a role model in my community, and I'm an economic asset to this country. I am proud to be here today to share my experience and support Europe's commitment to make America a country in which every young person, no matter where they're from, can create their own story. Thank you.
It sounded to me like he ought also be a future mayor of Baltimore. Let's give him a big hand. Thank you very much.
So you can imagine how lucky we are to work at Year Up when we've been able to work with thousands and thousands of young men and women like that, and to allow them the opportunity to realize their potential is, you can't find a better place to work personally in terms of helping someone across that journey. Okay, so that was kind of the Year Up, where we started, how we grew. We'll shift a little bit to, for those in the audience thinking about, well, how do I grow my own social enterprise? What lessons I've learned in this process? That's David today. So my hair's gray, but he's got none. He's 35 years old, has 2 beautiful children. His wife is expecting their 3rd. He graduated from the School for Visual Arts in New York City. He runs his own animation company and owns his own condo. Thank you very much. And he's a wonderful brother. Used to be a son, he's now, I think, a brother. Probably changed in our relationship. He's 35 years old. But I think when you're thinking about a social enterprise and starting something, these are as intense and as absolutely involved efforts as you could ever imagine getting into in your life. So connecting deeply with what it is that you are passionate about. What are you fanatic about? What would you walk through walls for? I had 3 years of Saturdays with David to start to see what was or wasn't happening for him. And that absolutely steeled my resolve to say, this is unacceptable and it's solvable. And so I took a lot of time with my wife and family before I decided to start Year Up, is to really try to connect first with yourself. Right? What is it that moves you? What are your life's experiences that have shaped what you care most about and are willing to do what it takes to try to serve and care for others? So I think that time, I took about 5 months talking to those who knew me best. Gabe, you talked about a mentor who helped you in your life. But talking to those mentors to really get to grips with, what are you good at? What are you passionate about? What can you commit to? When I first started Year Up, I said I'll commit 10 years to it. I've now committed 20 years to it. But I looked people in the eye and said, I'll commit 10 years of my life to this, period. That's going to happen. We're now in the 13th year, and I've committed for 20. But you can't just start these organizations and think it's going to be done in a couple of years. Right? You're making commitments to communities. And in our case, to young people who often have been let down by folks making promises to them. And so if we were going to start something, we had to have the staying power, which means the financial stability, programmatic quality, to make sure we would never let a young person down in this process. So I think there's a lot of looking in before you look out to say, what problem do I want to solve? Start first with yourself. Having done that, I spent about 4 months doing a huge amount of desk and field research, visited programs in Germany, in England, in California. Who is doing something with at-risk youth? Who is connecting to livable wage jobs? How would you start to build a program? What's working? What's not working? Interviewed a lot of people, talked to folks who knew much more than I did, and really started to build up a body of information that could be distilled down to a business plan, to try to write a business plan no different to one I would have written in my old software days, to raise capital to grow a business. I spent time with young people, and sat down in groups of young people, someone I knew who could gather young adults at risk, from low-income backgrounds, and just talk to them. What do they need? What were they getting? What were they not getting? Talk to social scientists, youth development experts. And so I'd really tried to invest a lot of time in figuring out what was the landscape, who else was doing something out there. I sure as heck didn't want to replicate something or start something if someone was already doing it in a community, because there's a lot of nonprofits. You don't need a new nonprofit that isn't solving some sort of unique challenge. And that took about, again, 4 to 5 months before I distilled it down to a business plan to get started. And as we did get started, I would say you want to start a social enterprise, get used to being out 3 or 4 nights a week, because you are relentlessly networking, absolutely relentlessly networking. I used to say I would go to the opening of an envelope, right? I don't care what it is, I'm showing up. Because at least in my home city, Boston, I had to figure out who influenced the city politically, financially, who are the donors, who are the people who could grow a program, and spent literally years of my life out. I'd often come home, have dinner with my children, and then head out to something and stay for long enough to know, was there someone I needed to meet? And then I'd probably slip off to maybe catch a bedtime story. But honestly did that relentlessly for about 3 years. And whether it was Senator Kennedy, this is a funny story with Senator Kennedy. That was in a famed restaurant in Boston. The first photograph we started to take was in front of a bar. And as the photograph was just about to be snapped, he looked behind him. He said, "Oh, that's not a good photograph for me to be in front of." He shifted everyone away from the bar to a different area. But whether it was, political figures, investors, community leaders, to really spend, I probably spent 20 hours a week networking and building a network. Now, I spent 10 years of my life in London before I moved back to Boston, so I didn't have a strong network in Boston. A lot of you already probably have very strong networks in your local communities and can develop those more quickly, but I was really starting at a pretty base level and had to build that up. The also goal was getting folks who would help you extend your network. And so our first few champions who would go out and have the lunches and the dinners and to just get us introduced to people who could help us build a network. So I would say whatever you think you spend networking, put a 5x on it. If you're starting from scratch and want to go quickly, because growing quickly requires capital, it requires stakeholders, you're going to invest a huge amount of time in that. I had a career in banking and in software. I didn't know much about education. Only my youth experiences were limited to David. I had no idea how much I didn't know. Absolutely no idea. And the best thing we did is we hired a diverse staff from day one, diverse in experience. So I look at Linda, who is a social worker by training and trading. She convinced me that one of my big views for the program was totally wrong. I said, we're going to locate in Roxbury, right in the heart of the inner city, and that's where we're going to be. And she said, you're crazy. You don't know what you're doing. She said, you want to be downtown where the businesses are. So from day one, young people get used to putting on a suit, coming downtown, being professional, taking themselves seriously. And so she was way righter than I was. I didn't know what I didn't know at that point. I remember Richard, who was a Haitian immigrant, who told a story of growing up in Miami under a deep level of racism he experienced in Miami, and what he had to teach himself. And I had my kind of myopic notions of our first instructor. I'm sure I'd have a master's degree, and it would be this and that. And Richard came up and he says, I don't have my degree. I don't have the qualifications you're asking for, but I'm going to be your best teacher. because I was your student. I've been your student, and I'm going to be your best teacher. He stayed with us for 10 years and then ended up coaching our instructors around the country and was our best teacher. So I think from day one, really working hard at what don't you know that you don't know. And in this field, I knew so little of social service, of elements of youth development. I'll tell you one quick story. I went to Stanley Pollock, who's one of the country's leading youth development experts. And he said, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to start this program called Year Up. He said, great. You got a bunch of 18 to 24-year-olds, low income. What are you going to do if they don't show up on time? I said, I don't know, Stanley, tell them to show up on time. And he said, okay, what are you going to do if they don't show up for the whole day? I don't know, hope they're there tomorrow, I guess. I mean, what else would you do? He looked at me and said, you really need me right now. You need me more than you know, because you don't know what you don't know. And for 6 months, Stanley took us every single Friday for 3 hours and taught us a basic grounding in youth development principles, which we use to this day 13 years later. I always thank God I bumped into Stanley Pollock. So what don't you know that you don't know is really important. That was a picture from our last year's retreat. We bring our staff together every year and a half from across the country. And there is nothing more important than the people you hire. Absolutely nothing more important. And in our case, we always say, we don't care how much you know till we know how much you care. Right? So we'll interview someone for a long time, not talk about functional, can you do finance or this. Why do you care? Why do you care so much about young people? Because that is the binding DNA for this organization. And what allows us to build a very strong, cohesive organization is making sure we had people with the right value and mission focus, and then expect they're going to be incredibly smart, capable people who can be the best at their chosen area. But we spend a huge amount of time. I feel bad. Someone's like, this is my 15th interview at Year Up. But I know that the best thing we can do is spend a lot of time finding the right talent. And at the same time, if someone's not in the right seat, make a hard decision and change them. And don't allow that to go on any longer than it needs to. You use the same disciplines I think you'd find in any for-profit organization in terms of relentlessly asking yourself, do I have the right people in the right seats across this whole organization and the right leadership in place to help manage them? The boards often finish where they start. When you're building a board, if your first 3, 4, 5 folks aren't the right quality, level, caliber, connective tissue, wealth category, you won't get the 6th to look like that. So when you're building your own boards, be incredibly patient. Have a ton of people at launch committee, advisory committee, call it whatever you want, but don't commit to put them in a fiduciary responsibility until you know darn well they're going to actually be what you need them to be to help you grow the organization. Because once you bring someone on in that capacity, it's really hard to have them not be there for the next several years of your organization's history. So we started with one gentleman very carefully. For the first year, we only had 3 people on our board. They happened to be folks who stayed with the organization for over a decade, were instrumental to its growth. But we would never, ever have achieved our success without those first few board members setting the tone and the tenor for what does it mean to be a board member of this organization. Because we're a working board. People chip in very deeply. It's not a ceremonial board or just a fiduciary board. So that advice I was given by one of my colleagues was also bring on board members who are kind of your contemporaries. Because if you're going to do this for 10 years, you want someone to grow with you who's also on a trajectory, maybe in a different sector, in getting stronger, more powerful, more influential, wealthier, but you're going to grow up together over the next 10 or 15 years, and that was absolutely right. So we didn't just go for a name who would be visible. We went with high potential young people, in my case where I was 35 when I started, and we've grown together now to our late 40s. They have progressed in their careers and been increasingly helpful as the organization's gotten bigger. That was great advice I got. It's not just to put on a name, it was get someone who's in a high trajectory themselves in their own sector. So that's been incredibly important for us. A couple thoughts around selling. I went to Harvard Business School, and you will never hear the word sales mentioned. It's a big failing of business schools, is they won't talk about sales. Well, any successful CEO can persuade and influence people. whether it's a donor, someone to join your staff that you're going to hire, whether it's selling a strategic direction to the board. You're using persuasion and influence, which is sales. Yet we don't talk about sales. I talked to a wonderful organization yesterday who was so shy about asking for money, like they were doing someone a disservice. It's like, man, we ask someone for money. We're offering someone an opportunity to show their values in a way that they want to across this country. We're not asking for something, we're offering something. And so really focusing, especially as the leaders of nonprofits, you're going to spend 50% of your time in an external capacity, generating stakeholders, raising money, selling ideas, influencing politicians. That's part of the success in that job. It's an external role. And so sales is positive, it's not negative. And if you have any concerns about asking for money, get rid of them from day one. It's a good thing to do. The other piece of this is trying to hire people, not only the right people in the right seats, but truly hire people who don't have your skill set. I'll give a good example. Sean Bowen is pictured here. I hired her in development. And the first day on the job, she came to me and said, I'm so glad I work here, but I actually don't want to do this job. There's a more important job for me to do. I said, Sean, you're killing me. I said, I just spent months on a search and you're development director. She said, no, you don't need that. You can find someone to do that. What you need is to think about influence and how do you maximize social impact and how systemic change will work in this organization, because you have a direct service business today. And you're not leveraging that across a much wider spectrum of legislators, of systemic change, of of organizational building in the communities you're in. She said, that's what I can do for you. Now, she came from the Marshall Gans School of Community Organizing. She understood that. She'd been involved in activist movements in the past. And she saw something which was very foreign to a Wall Street perspective of how you build power in this country, which tends to be viewed top-down in Wall Street. But real power is bottom-up. Real systems change is bottom-up. So in this case, Sean had such a different set of skills than I did, but together we were able to complement each other. It reminded me of a previous time in my career. We had an organizational expert come in. We're about 50 people strong in the software business. And we said, tell us about what you see and who we are. And he said, I can't believe it. You've hired everyone who looks just like the guys who run the company. That's going to push you way off track. And you won't know when you're making mistakes because you're all reinforcing each other's thought process. And so that concept of really looking at what you're less good at and hiring into that and leaning into that has been important for our senior team and our executives across the country, is really respecting, valuing, and trying to bring that diverse and complementary set of skills to the forefront. Without Sean, we wouldn't be doing all the work we're doing to influence legislation and building movements, which we do significantly now in the cities we're in. I'd love to tell you that we started Year Up without working a heck of a lot of hours. I'd be lying. So the investment of time is huge. Now, granted, I love this and I'm a fanatic about it, so it's not bad time, it's not work for me, it's a joy, it's a blessing. I didn't take a salary for 6 years, so I'm happy to do it every minute I can. But I'm also a father and a husband. So the advice I'd give you for those out either running nonprofits or thinking about starting them is throw away the idea of work-life balance. Because balance implies either or. And think about the concept of work-life integration. It's a much more powerful concept of how to think about integrating different aspects of your life. For example, last night at 6 o'clock, Akeem shows up at our house to have dinner. He's a wonderful young man. He's working at Harvard Business School in the IT department. He just finished his learning development phase. I live in that area, so he could get quickly over to us. I'm a mentor to him. He's one of our students in the program. But I want to integrate that with our lives. So our children sit down to dinner every week with a pretty diverse dinner table. That meets some of the goals I would have for how I want our family to be. It's time efficient because I'm going to eat dinner around 7 o'clock anyways, right? So this is a leverage in my sense. And at 8 o'clock I can say, Akeem, let me get you a cab because I'm going to put my children in bed now and read them their bedtime stories. So that's a complete integration of life that in my case has worked, but I could give you 25 other examples of how to think about integrating those lives in ways that allow you to still get an A as a mother, as a spouse, as a father, as a worker. And the best thing I ever did was grade myself every year, once a year, really hard by yourself when it's quiet, look at the mirror, 6 a.m. before anyone's awake, and give yourself grades as a, in my case, husband, father, family member, friend, and worker. And you can't lie because it's just you, right? I guess you could BS yourself, but it doesn't matter. So give yourself the grades and say, do I like my grades? Do I like my grades? It was 1990, goodness, 6, 7, where I got 1 A, 3 C's, and 1 D. And I vowed in that date that would never, ever happen to me again in my life. And thank God it hasn't happened to me again in my life. And I'm pretty honest in grading. In fact, if you ask your children if you're being a good father and they're seeing enough of you, they'll tell you. Without any uncertain terms, they'll tell you what they need from their parents. So I think this whole thing for me has been learning how to integrate a life when we often are people who live always in 4th or 5th gear. You know, we don't really stop and relax and take it easy. It wasn't how we were designed. So how do you integrate a high-paced life so that you can really be attendant to all the stakeholders that you want to be attendant to? I'll finish, and we'll have about 15, 20 minutes for questions. This is a beautiful photo. I think you'd agree. It's every year across all of our cities, we have a walk for opportunity where students, volunteers, mentors from all across Europe's network will walk in those cities, dressed professionally, walking for opportunity. In this case, that was in National Capital Region in Washington. And I thought, what an interesting parallel, that 50 years ago, 1963, on that very same soil, 1 million people got together to talk about issues of economic and social justice. And then in an incredibly humble way today, we get the privilege to carry on in our small contribution to this much larger journey, that journey of economic justice for young people. And to know of how many of those young people now are working, have jobs, are buying homes. In fact, one young man in that photo, I remember he told me the story. He said, Gerald, I grew up in a homeless shelter. I've lived in 18 different houses in my life. He said, I bought my own home as a result of going through this program. He said, do you know what it feels like to carry your child over your threshold, to cook dinner with your wife in your kitchen, to put your son to bed in his bed? He said, I'm not sure you can appreciate what that feels like when you grew up where I grew up, to know that, that my son will never have that instability in his life, and he's getting his college degree and a good job because dad's got his. And I'll be the role model for my son. That's how we change communities. That's how we change this country. And that's why I think we're very fortunate to do the work at Year Up. That's a photo I've often said, write 3 things on my grave: good father, good husband, and put up that photo, and I'm happy. Don't need anything else. In that certainly photo, I look at a lot because it is that justice we need if we're going to have a country that we want to have. So I'm going to stop there, and I think the design for these is to make sure we leave time for questions. And so I'll say thank you and then open it up. And I think there's a mic runner as well. If folks have questions, we'll get your mic and happily try to address them.
Thanks so much for the very, I think, clear and concrete advice, which is always very sort of useful. I just had a question in terms of, obviously you've been at this for a while, you've proven your model, you've expanded that model, and as you've thought about expansion and sort of where you kind of put this, there's a huge need for this in major cities and even not in major cities all around the country. What are the principles that you go back to when you think about those expansions and kind of the appropriate rate and pace at which to do that when you want to kind of, I would imagine, accelerate the change and take this thing that works and bring it everywhere?
It's a good question. We were fortunate to have a lot of pro bono help from Monitor & Company, and spent, it would have been about 6, 7 years ago, one of several studies with them where we said, how do you take an East Coast program and prove that it's not just an anecdote or an East Coast bright spot? And so it was really with Monitor. We thought about geographic expansion. We thought about building sustainable revenue so that we could build assets for communities and not just kind of occasional good things happening. And that set our sights on getting to initial 8 cities in the West, East, Midwest, and South to prove that it had national significance and could be run not without the closeness of the folks who founded the organization. So that was a really clear strategic goal in order to prove significance. Also building a body of evidence while we were doing that. We then said, what amount of capital would it take to grow the organization, assuming we're scaling at a rate that we can still control quality, added up that capital, put together an IPO document, and raised $20 million of effectively growth capital back in 2007, and then expended that capital over 5 years, $4 million a year, which effectively subsidized that growth plan. So we knew what it would cost, we knew why we wanted to grow, and then what it would take to start to build the process and the infrastructure to do that. And before any of that happened, we went and raised the $20 million. So because it takes so much effort to grow a program, it's kind of hard to raise money at the same time you're growing the program, at least big chunks of money. So we really decided to front load the capital. We're doing the exact same thing today. So we have a $55 million fund. We've raised about $39 million of it. And that's capitalizing this next 5 years of growth, without which that capital we could never push forward with the forthrightness that we're doing to expand to new communities and to test some new ideas. We're going to go here and then back over here.
Do you believe government failed the education of these children that are in your program? And if so, do you think that government has to change? Well, there's a big debate, the charter schools, vouchers, homeschooling, public education. What changes would you make in that to not to put you out of business?
Right. And first of all, great question. We would love to be out of business. I'm on the Board of Education for Massachusetts, so we oversee K-12 for 1 million children in Massachusetts. The reason why I wanted to join that board, which is a $4.6 billion budget, is to look upstream, right? Because you could argue slightly crassly that Europe is an emergency room, and the goal of healthcare shouldn't be to build emergency rooms, it should be to keep patients healthy. So I think any entity like Europe is always going to look upstream to think about what would help young people make better and more productive transitions after high school that were successful, so they didn't need a program as intensive as a year up. Or how can you take year up and put it into the system which existed in this country called community colleges, serving 13 million people, half of all the people who go to college, allow them to achieve what they would want to achieve in terms of completion rates and gainful employment. So right now, one of our biggest systems of education, community colleges, isn't achieving it as the level they would all want to, and we would want them to. And so we look at, yes, K-12, yes, community college systems, and think how can we influence what happens in those legislatively. Through my Board of Ed work, I've done a lot of work on career preparation in high school and middle school. The answer to your question, are we, as a government, failing education, is an interesting question. I always ask, how do you weigh up societal responsibility and individual responsibility? How you put 100 pennies on the sides of the scale probably has something to do with your political affiliations. How you think about different levels of responsibility. I think there's responsibility for both the individual and our government to make sure that our most disadvantaged populations have what they need to realize their potential. So charter schools are wonderful, but across the country they do no better than public schools. Fact, totally proven by research. Good charters outperform anything you'd ever find. KIPP, Uncommon Schools, great organizations, but charters on average aren't the answer if you just looked at data across the whole country. So no one's yet proven we can scale an educational system to deliver the outcomes we want, because the good charters we have are still relatively finite in their size and scope. But it's not just blaming our schools or our teachers. I don't think that's the answer. I think it's a much broader answer.
The
rating of the teacher. The city is going to, has lost and potentially hundreds of millions of dollars, and the state is interested, and the governor is going to impose his own rating system because the unions and the city administration cannot agree. How would you form a rating system? What type of rating system do you think should be implemented in the school systems to rate the teacher's performance versus the student outcome?
So I can say in Massachusetts we use student growth percentiles, which we can compare at the teacher level. So we can normalize a group of students and say the students you have today, we know how much you should increase your academic preparedness in 1 year, and if you're above or below the norm based on the data we have. So you can really look at how you as a teacher are progressing those students above or below the median. So that we have in Massachusetts incredibly good data to say which teachers are moving students on average better than their counterpart teachers, and which students are not moving them. Now that's according to standardized testing, which has its flaws, but is a useful system to get some gauge of assessment. What I would say is it should be a combination of assessments that are formative and summative. It should be student input, because it's been proven that student assessment of teacher is about as accurate as anything you can get. And it should be peer-based as well, because teachers also know which other teachers are doing well, and observation-based. So it is several assessments, both from the administrative side, I believe the purely outcome side, and also I would not discount using students in how they view their teachers. We never hire a teacher at year up without having students interview them, or for them to mock teach to students so they can actually tell us what they thought of that teacher. In fact, we just hired an executive director, and part of the interview process is meet with students, and those students literally took several contenders out of the equation because they weren't feeling it. And that's purely acceptable for me as a reason not to go forward with someone. Hand over here.
Yep. When you first started talking to the company, your partner companies, the employers, were they initially skeptical of the talent pool you were providing versus the traditional accredited talent pool that they could recruit from anyway? And if so, how'd you get them over that? How'd you build a track record to scale the way you did?
So they were definitely skeptical, especially when we had no track record and no reference points. And I remember saying I used to walk, a mile on my hands and knees over broken glass to get someone to say, we'll take one young person. And that first class had to do well, or else we wouldn't have a chance to place other folks. So it was very hard. It took leaders. So here at NYU, the leadership said, we believe in these young people. Right? And across the country, the companies we worked in, it has been leaders who made the initial decision to pilot the program. I remember talking to Jamie Dimon, Ken Chenault, and they said, I get it. I'll give you the air cover to show you can do what you say, but you better do what you say, right? Because we're giving you the opportunity. All of the repurchasing and growth of Europe is supervisory on up. So you sell it top down, you grow it bottom up, because I recognize we're several pay grades below what probably Jamie Dimon's worried about on a day-to-day basis. But no one gets a bonus for giving a low-income student from Harlem a break, right? So it takes leaders who see the fact that businesses have to be in the business of solving social challenges as well. I was with John Whitehead recently, who you would know probably better than I, given his reputation in New York City. He was at a meeting in the Social Enterprise Initiative at Harvard Business School, and he pounded his hand on the desk, and he said, if businesses don't get increasingly in the business of solving social challenges, tell me who will. Because the government will not be in a position to do it over the next 20, 30 years. So if we're not teaching business leaders and all of our leaders to think broadly about their societal responsibility, he said, I fear for our democracy. John's got a pretty good perspective and a pretty bright gentleman. So I think there are leaders out there. In fact, I know there are leaders out there who do think very broadly. And then all we need is our foot in the door, and then our students are going to take it from there. Yes, ma'am.
My question specifically has to do with when you started that initial funding. Where did that come from, and what advice would you give to someone who's starting a nonprofit and not without any money, and then building that track record so that they can actually approach funders for support and revenue?
So Muhammad Ali once said, you hit the body enough times, the head will fall. Which what he meant by is that if you just keep doing the right things right every day, you keep working, eventually you'll hit your goal. So I have to admit, people who see me coming down the street in Boston cross the street. Right? Now the problem is they know what I'm going to do, and I also know what I have to do. So I was pretty relentless in asking people not to give me money, to get involved, to care. This is not about people who are wealthy. They recognize they're lucky to give away money, and they want to find a place to match with their values. My job is to expose the values and the mission in such a way that people can opt into it, but to do that all the time. So I'd meet someone. In fact, I was at a lawyer because I was moving back to this country and I needed to sort out some legal issues with my wife, who's British. I met with an immigration attorney, and she said, wow, it's really neat what you're doing. One of my partners at the law firm would be interested to hear about this. So I met with Marty Kaplan. Marty said, I really like this. In fact, I used to be the chairman of the Board of Ed. I really get what you're doing. Come back in 2 weeks and I'll have a lunch for you. And let's introduce you to a few people you don't know in the city. And then literally, if I trace back probably $15 million from that lunch over the next decade, just from what Marty did. Now it's a matter of course when I meet someone like Marty, I say, would you consider holding a lunch or a breakfast or something to help expose us to a few folks who might be interested in this mission? I promise I won't ask them for money. I'm just going to expose them to this. And if they want to join in this journey, they will. But you got to remember, this was probably 40% of my time. Because we're growing from $200,000 to $61 million, right? We needed the capital. We had to get ahead of ourselves every year. If you want to have 6 months cash in the bank, you have to keep over-raising money every year. So if you grow at a slower pace, you don't need to spend probably as much time doing that. But I wanted to grow at a pretty quick pace, and therefore fundraising for me was a big chunk of time, both jobs and money, over that first certainly 7 to 10 years. Just be relentless. Like, think about a young person, right? Think about the young man you saw, Kai. He would want you fighting for him, wouldn't he? Like he would want you walking through walls for him. So every time I work hard, I think that's what Kai would want. And so it's a natural act in that regard, but it's going to be a big chunk of your time.
Thanks a lot, Gerald. Kind of related question. How have you dealt with and how do you deal with adversity and doubters, people who kind of, doubt your mission? How do you keep the energy that you have, the vision that you have, that kind of willingness to, crawl on your knees through glass when there's clearly been, setbacks and people who, doubt you at times?
One of the first things is knowing you're authentically connected to what you're doing is a real reserve. And I'm sure folks in the room who know exactly what I'm saying is when you literally will do whatever it takes. And I've often felt lucky to have found something that I would do that with and for. So when our students develop and do well, I get the exact same emotional highs when my own children do well. So that's a pretty strong emotion in a draw. Now, you ask about setbacks. I get asked all the time, what's hard? And I can look them in the eye and say, honestly, in 13 years, I've not considered this to be work or hard, other than when one of our students is in harm's way. So my calibration of what hard is different, because hard for me is burying someone. That's really, really hard, especially in a country which no other country in the world buries its young like America does, right? And you think, how in Lord's name do we get to a place where we bury young people as a matter of fact every day? That to me is a hard day. Everything else for me, if I compare it to those hard days, seems like, well, it's just business. Just get on, work through it. Also, joy is so joyous in this business. When you hear that young man talk about carrying his son across the threshold, I don't know about you, but there's very few things that move me that deeply about giving in this country. The American dream should not be the American nightmare, right? It should be a country where mobility is something we all get access to. And last time I checked, that was the philosophy of the country, right? So to do things which you believe are in your country's interest and are joyous to the individual, okay, what's hard? Yeah, people are going to leave. You're going to have problems. At times you're not going to raise enough money. At times something's going to go wrong. Now, I've had students do things which were tough. I can remember the day. CIO of Fortune 20 company, called me and said, one of your students just stole 2 PCs. And then he proceeded for 15 minutes to scream at me. You told me these students would do well. You promised me. And then he really offended us by saying something that I hate to repeat. He said, I knew those people would steal. Right? So then I said, we got the wrong partner here. But I took, yelled for about 15, 20 minutes. And then I went over, I said, would you like to prosecute the young man? Because I don't condone stealing. I brought the young man in and talked to him. And I remember that lesson for me was very important. I said, the gentleman with me is so angry because we worked for years for this relationship. And the relationship was now in threat. And this was years of effort to build a relationship. And the gentleman next to me was red in the face. He was so angry. And the gentleman came in, and I wasn't angry at all. And I just looked at him and I said, are you okay? Because I know you're a good man. And I know something must have been really, really wrong in your life for you to make such a bad decision. So let's first ask, are you okay? Because I know you're not a bad person. And the gentleman next to me said, aren't you just upset about this? I said, no, because I know no one's as bad as their last act, right? Or as good as their last act. And we all make mistakes. And so, I know, hard and adversity for me are measured on a different scale today than it was in the private sector, which I think gives me a little more resiliency in worrying about problems. And so I just, honestly, it's just not how I think about work as being a 4-letter word. Work for me is a 3-letter word called joy, and I get to do it every day. And I know some people may not believe that, but I can promise you through and through, that's exactly how I feel.
Hi. How did you use research and evaluation to fix what went wrong during your startup years, and what's going to go wrong as you mature?
Right. And the question is, what don't I know is going to go wrong? So, yeah, exactly. The best thing we did is in 5 years into a mission, we spent $300,000. Imagine we were only a couple $1 million organization at that point. We spent $300,000 putting in place a world-class management information system and ability to collect data. And at that point, this was a huge project. And now we got the award from Salesforce.com as the #1 implementation of their software to help run a nonprofit. And it's a pretty big organization. We now derive our entire business off good data, but we made a decision to not only put in the database, but to have it drive the process of the organization so that people, as a matter of course, have to be entering information. So imagine that email I get that tells me who got a job. Someone entered that in Baltimore, and it all gets aggregated and pushed out and tabulated. But that's because there's a platform of systems. Once you have the systems and the data, you can now start to evaluate how you're doing and start to build that body of evidence. We did one randomized controlled trial about 6 years ago. Incredibly important for us to do. Lots of moral hazard. You go and flip a coin for young people you've already said yes to. That's very painful for our staff. We really try hard to recognize that. But that randomized controlled trial got people like James Heckman, who some of you know is a Nobel Prize-winning economist. He's written about early childhood education. James Heckman typically said, I don't believe in investing in 18-year-olds because if you haven't made it by 18, you're a lost cause. Not in those terms, but he said it kind of like that. As a result of our research, he said, you know what, I'm rethinking what we should be investing in 18-year-olds. Because I've seen a model with good research and a causal data, right, that says you can have a huge return investing in that 18-year-old. And he said, it's changed my view as to which programs we may want to invest in. Well, the federal government talks to people like James Heckman and thinks about building policy for the country. So what I learned is social science is rich in this country. It influences policy. It influences the agenda. And if you don't have good causal information, you can't ever change the country in the way that we would hope to someday. So yeah, building a body of evidence for us is critical. You can't grow a nonprofit without it. It costs money. It should be budgeted. But it's going to go on for years and years and years.
So what's going to go wrong in the future?
So we have grown Europe to the size it is. We're trying to now take it to not 10x, but 100x. So we can see 10x, but 10x would just be linear growth. So we're trying to get on a path to 100x, which means partnering with community colleges, having Europe exist within those entities, physically and geographically. And we have not yet proven that that's going to work in the way we think it can work, and scale in the way we think. it can. Now that's our aspiration, that's our strategic plan. We're doing it now in Miami and Baltimore. We haven't yet proven it. So what can go wrong if that doesn't work? Our posit or our strategy around how to scale to 100,000, we may have to rethink. Right now we think that's going to work, but we haven't yet evaluated that in the way that we'll need to going forward. And then here, do those three.
Thank you so much for a lot of encouragement today. You've spoken a lot about the building and the entrepreneurship component, but I'm curious if you could just share a little bit about how, when you first went into these communities to, market yourself. And I know you talked about having, one of your colleagues, mentor you and teach you about community organizing. But, for many of us in our desire to serve, it's so important for us to really know and to be able to speak the language and really establish our credibility. So could you share with us, I'm sure there were obstacles that you faced in, starting out that way, but if you could just share a little bit about it and encourage us in those ways to think about these things?
It's a great question. When I first came back to Boston and said, here's what we're going to do, there were plenty of people in the community. And now we serve a population that's 97, 98% of color. It's 100% low income. And people would say to my face, no offense, Joe, but what's a former software guy, white guy, Wall Street, Harvard, what are you doing in this community? And do you have any idea what this community is or how it operates? You didn't come from here. And I said, you are absolutely right to question that. I fully accept the question, and all I'm going to ask you to do is give me 5 years and judge us purely by our outcomes in the way in which we work with the community. So if we work as partners in collegiality and according to a set of values and we have good outcomes, that's the only thing I'm going to ask you to look at. We got called by the Wall Street Journal and New York Times when we first started Europe. I turned down both of those interviews. I said the worst thing we can do is say we've done something. We have done nothing yet. So I always say, let your actions speak. Do spend a lot of time with community members and ask them what is important. We went to Chicago. We gathered up the youth development agencies and said, please tell us what you think we need to know and how can we best serve with you in your community. We did that in New York as well. So we never committed dollars and or opened up in a city without first going through a process of talking to the community-based organizations and respecting their work. They having done this for decades, and we're carpetbaggers from Boston, right? So I think always being humble, no matter how successful is a strange word, but no matter where we've come from, keep your humility regardless of anything. And that's the best way, I think, to never offend anyone is to make sure, recognize how many other people have paved the way and done good work. And so we bring that to a community, and hopefully they hear and feel that as we come into a new community. I'll go here. I know you're waiting, and then here. You're very patient.
So one of the things that really struck me was your graph about sort of like increasing the number of young people being served by the program. So replicating the program model to other cities, increasing the number of you served in these cities, and as you're sort of integrating the program model into these community colleges, how are you keeping the funding momentum going? Like, what is the sustainability strategy for Europe?
So each of our cities will have their own budgets and expectations of raising money and have their own development professionals and executives in those cities who raise capital. So you imagine you could have one entity do it, which is dangerous, or you could have 11 do it, which spreads the risk across a much greater number of individuals. So one is, the strategy is every organization is on its own even bottom, so to speak. So that's one way to do it. The internship revenue grows exponentially. If students do well, then we're getting that revenue because corporations pay us to provide them with that talent. So that's now, as I said, about 50 to 60% of our operating revenue comes through that, helping companies build labor supply chains effectively. And we don't get much money from the government, a couple $1 million a year. As Gabe said, they spend $18 billion, but we don't fit the neat boxes, which is a bit crazy in my view. We're working hard to change how the government thinks about paying for outcomes rather than efforts. But it's largely, there's a great article from Stanford on scaling nonprofits, and it said most nonprofits that have scaled have got very operationally good at one dominant revenue stream. So they've figured out how to be the best, whether it's Pat Lawler at Youth Villages and government money, or Habitat for Humanity getting $20 on average across $800 million of money each year. But they got really good at operationalizing a revenue stream. That for us is two things. It's the internships, which is the dominant stream, and then individual donors who give an opportunity for each student to go through the program. We're trying to get really good at those two revenue streams and not try to be all things to all people and raise all types of money. Rather raise fewer types of money, but be the best at it and invest in the infrastructure and the competencies to do it, much like any for-profit business would figure out how do they sell to their market. But I think the article from Stanford was very, very good for me to realize you can't do a little bit of this, 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 because you never get good at anything, and that's risky for a business. You folks have been a great audience. I'm going to be just next door outside this to the left for a few minutes. I sadly have got to be on a plane at 3 o'clock, so don't find me rude if I leave somewhere around before 2 o'clock. I'm told it won't take me that long to get to LaGuardia. Gabe, hopefully. And I just want to say that as you contemplate these journeys, whether it's as executives, entrepreneurs, whether it's as investors helping to do this, whether it's as board members, that, you know, as not my words, David Gergen's, this represents some of the next steps in civil rights, is social entrepreneurship. And the promise of social entrepreneurship is just beginning to be felt. Just beginning to be felt, and we need folks like Gabe and others being super successful because there's a lot of talent in this country who wants to come into this sector. We have to make sure it's a strong sector to get the best talent across this country. And I know, Gabe, you and NYU are helping to lead the way, so I want to say thank you, and thank you to all of you today.